I'm going to talk about emerging infectious diseases. And I first want to give a sense of what we actually mean by emerging infectious diseases. It's much more than just a few viruses affecting human beings and making headlines periodically. The whole scope of emerging infectious diseases are all pathogens affecting us and every species upon which we depend for socioeconomic reasons. And this includes diseases we've never seen before but are seeing now, as well as diseases that we thought we had contained or eradicated that are coming back. This number, $1.3 trillion dollars per year, represents the annual treatment costs and production losses due to what are called the high probability, low impact emerging infectious diseases. These are the ones that are ongoing all the time that do not make headlines. And that is greater than the GDP of all but 15 countries. And that's a value that was generated before the COVID pandemic, of course. Now, in addition to being costly in their own right, this drip of costs in the high probability, low impact emerging diseases is not only expensive, but it weakens our capacity to cope with the low probability, high impact emerging diseases such as COVID was. There are a number of things that we have discovered that most people, especially people in the policy realm, do not understand, that we think they should understand in order to see how to cope with the emerging infectious disease crisis in a different way. And the first is that we have to stop thinking of pathogens as enemies. They're not enemies. They are components of the biosphere, they're natural components of the biosphere, and their effects on us are not a personal insult to us. This is simply part of how they make a living. The second is that pathogens do not magically appear and disappear. They are present even when they're not producing disease or headlines. The reemergence of Ebola this week is a perfect example of that. The World Health Organization announced that they had eradicated Ebola. Of course, that was not true. What they meant was that there were no active Ebola cases in human beings for a month, but Ebola as a pathogen had not disappeared from the planet and has not magically reappeared. The third is the colonizing new hosts, which is the essence of an emerging disease. A pathogen emerges into a new host. That kind of phenomenon does not require new genetic capacities. In other words, pathogens do not have to evolve new capabilities to colonize a new host before they colonize that host. It turns out that emerging infectious diseases are expressions of pre-existing capacities given new opportunities. There are always many hosts around the world that are susceptible to pathogens, but they're not being exposed to those pathogens on a regular basis. So we don't know that they're susceptible and potential hosts. The fourth is that there is a direct relationship between climate change and emerging infectious diseases. For the last year and a half, we've been hearing a constant drum of, we have global climate change, and now we have COVID. But the reality is that these are not separate entities. The emerging infectious disease phenomenon is an aspect of global climate change in a very simple and fundamental way. And that is that climate change initiates movement among species. That gives opportunistic species like pathogens more opportunities to be opportunistic. And that is what creates the crisis. This is what creates a very large risk space for emerging diseases. The fifth is that human civilization has created additional new categories of opportunities for pathogens. Agriculture and domestication, sedentary living and urbanization, global trade and travel, migration and organized conflict have all increased the movement of pathogens and the movement of susceptible hosts among pathogens, creating ever more opportunities for pathogens to emerge, for diseases to emerge. And finally, the thing that is mostly denied by current scientific paradigms is that we can be proactive about coping with emerging diseases. The assumption is that if we have to wait for a pathogen to accidentally evolve the capacity to get into a new host, we can't predict that. And we have to wait until the disease occurs and then try to cope with it after the fact. However, if colonizing new hosts actually is based on pre-existing capacities, we can anticipate how those pathogens might operate in new circumstances in conjunction with susceptible hosts they've never seen before. We have to understand that proactive behavior with respect to the emerging disease crisis cannot be simply an add-on or a marginal thing to do. It must be foremost. And the reason for this is because if pathogens colonize new hosts using pre-existing capacities, once they arrive in the new host, they then are capable of evolving independently within the new host. And at that point, new capacities may emerge that are not predictable. If we wait until that happens, then unsustainably expensive crisis response is our only option. And we have proposed this, what's called the DAMA protocol for document, assess, monitor, and act, or what we call finding them before they find us. And this is a combination of grassroots to international level scientific and policy activities. And the idea is that if we know what's coming, we can buy time while searching for long-term solutions. We can buy time because we can anticipate what diseases, what pathogens are going to do as they come towards us and our crops and our livestock, and we can act to mitigate their advance, we can act to mitigate their impacts as they approach us. And we have to adopt a sense of urgency for this, because that $1.3 trillion per year number is actually growing, and it has not stopped just because COVID is taking over the headline. We actually have very little control over pathogen capacity, that is, the evolved capabilities of pathogens to infect new hosts. But we can monitor, avoid, and minimize opportunities for encounter between pathogens and compatible hosts. And that is the essence of buying some time while we look for long-term solutions. Thank you.
The floor is now open for questions to Dan.
Can I make a point? Lord Martin Rees made a very fundamental point. Politicians act short term, but the issues are all long term. And Dan has made another even more important point. You know, buying time is all about time scales, okay? That actually, if we are willing to spend preventive, okay, even on the risks that we recognize, you know, we can avoid very heavy future costs. But we're not doing this. And why aren't we doing this? Because the stupid economists refuse to acknowledge this. You know, they use this, you know, rational man argument and price time the same, right? Without understanding this huge time inconsistency that involves costs. And since we don't know about the future costs, let's ignore it, right? So I think this is a very important argument, and when the time comes, I think so Martin and others who have spent a lot more time on thinking about time issues and the different time cycles, may want to address this, because it's fundamental to our understanding. Everything that is very expensive, when the accident happens, all politicians ignore. I can't deal with it. I don't have time to deal with this. I have to deal with the urgent, right? So it really is an issue that we have to address, because this is the elephant in the room we refuse to admit, that the economist paradigm based upon Newtonian classical views is completely outdated. The point that was made by Gert, by the way, and also Tim.
All right. Thank you. There's one question that just came in.
Well, just quickly, I mean, I was bold enough to mention concern about engineered pandemics. Is that just doom mongering, or do you think we do need to worry about monitoring to minimize the risk of that happening? Bad actors.
Well, the major firewall, there's an evolutionary firewall against engineered biological weapons being very effective. And that is that pathogens don't distinguish sort of their makers from their targets. I mean, pathogens are better at understanding that things like skin color and language are irrelevant when it comes to the biological unity of human beings. And another element that's talked about a lot with respect to things like biological weapons, the notion biological terrorism. So infecting somebody, having them get onto an airplane, walk through an airport, this sort of thing, which is the way that influenza is spread and COVID was spread and all of that. Again, the major issue has been that in order to be certain that the putative terrorist is infected and infectious, you have to wait until symptoms appear, at which point that person will likely be interdicted while trying to get onto an airline. So it's biological weapons in the evolutionary context are a fairly clumsy tool and not easy to direct outwards. So I'm not, I do understand that there are going to be governments that are going to be messing around with these ideas. But compared with the natural emergence of pathogens and our human technological impact on the planet, intensifying those historical effects, I think that's much more of a problem than worrying about what we might be trying to do technologically. So the bioterrorism is sort of the bête noire of medication and vaccination. Most people think that vaccination is a great medical victory for humanity. But the reality is that the most effective 20-year period in human history for producing vaccines was 1880 to 1900. And we have been falling behind in terms of cost of production and time to production on vaccines ever since then. And I think that we're looking at there's an analogous situation with bioterrorism, bioweapons, and things like that. I'm not saying that there are probably people who are going to think about doing this, but I don't think it's going to be hugely cost effective for any government that's thinking about trying to implement something like this.
Okay, there's two more questions I think you can probably answer very short. The questions are very clear. One is by Nick Gowing, who said, how much then have we been blindly living largely charmed lives and on borrowed time, assuming the only option is optimistic? That's one.
Well, I think that's a really good point. I mean, it's a really good way of putting this. And I think we're now at a point where we understand that the notion that our technology could always run ahead of the biology, we have finally gotten to the point where we understand that this is not true, that we cannot expect that to work. And we must have something else, which is essentially a better understanding of the basic biology behind what is happening, which then allows us to mitigate the impacts. In other words, instead of trying to what we call medicate, vaccinate, and eradicate, the emphasis should be on coexisting and avoiding exposure. But that's very time consuming because it means that, for example, the scientific community is going to have to spend a lot of time working with local people and recruiting citizen scientists to help them document what's going on out there and explaining to them why they should be doing this. And these are activities that most academic scientists, most museum taxonomists don't want to be bothered with.
Okay, then the last question before we go to the break, that is by Jan Staman, which I think might also be a very short answer, but it's so, he says, these zoonose outbreaks are not anymore acts of God. States and government shall be blamed for the future of new outbreaks. Does that make states sensitive for more long-term policy? Question to you.
Well, that's also a really critical point to make. The way that I've been expressing that when I give talks to a more general audience has been to say that the reason I think this is, we now have a good idea of what we could do to make things better. But the reason that it's going to be difficult to imagine how those would be implemented is that fundamentally, this means that we have to begin cooperating with our neighbors. And especially, we have to be able to cooperate with people we don't like very much. So any country that has a traditional conflict relationship with a neighbor, somehow they have to work together. They have to understand that sharing information and sharing expertise about mitigating the impact of emerging diseases is in everybody's best interest. And that whatever conflicts they want to continue with have to be with respect to other factors than emerging diseases. Now, that's not saying that I have any great optimism that this will happen, but at least we know what we could do.